Good morning. I'm Len. I'm your host of Target Justice v. Garland, a podcast about extraordinary lawsuits. And today we have an extraordinary guest, David Hughes, a lecturer associated with Lincoln University in UK. And if you haven't heard his name, you simply must. A lot of people recognize your name from the legendary publication in 2022 about what's in COVID vaccines, but we'll get to it later. But for now, David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Len. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
The pleasure is all mine. So, this is the cover of the latest book by David Hughes called COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy, Volume 1. Can you tell us about a little bit about how this book came about, David?
Yes, it came about in July 2020, which is when the masks were first introduced in the UK. And I was so viscerally disgusted by what I was seeing. And by this stage, it was self-evident to anybody with a shred of common sense that what was taking place was not right. It was an abomination. And from my previous work on 9/11, I also understood that it was a psychological operation. And I wasn't quite sure how exactly it was all working at the time because, of course, the kind of shock and awe of the early days and the deliberate use of confusion and so on were designed to addle the mind. But I knew something was badly wrong. And I made a decision in July 2020 that I was going to put down the research that I had been engaged with on international relations theory, where I'd made quite a bit of progress, because I understood that this was far more important. And I decided then that I was going to take a stand against this. So I began my research in earnest back then, and it has taken, well, it took 3 years to write this book. There will also be volume 2, so this really is only half of the project. And as you know, I've additionally done other work during that time, for example, around the so-called vaccines, challenging Desmond's mass formation theory and so on. So there's been quite a bit of work taking place. The nature of academic work is that it is kind of slow and thorough and careful and rigorous. And in that respect, it moves a lot slower than journalism or blogging or anything like that. And in addition, there was a 10-month delay with the publisher. This manuscript was actually submitted in June 2023, but didn't come out until April 2024. So it's all gone a little bit slower than I would have liked. But this really is the kind of the sum of many of my efforts over the last few years.
Thank you, David. This reminds me of my own intellectual growth when I realized what's going on, the significance of it for Homo sapiens as a species. Then it was full stop, and I dedicated my own work in addition to my involvement with the organization Target Justice, dedicated my time to educating people and especially talking to experts and specialists and doctors who are absolutely unaware of this technocratic process, a technocratic event in history. This is when I started following your career. This, to me, is not just a paper, it's a bookmark in time that for the first time, a well-referenced, well-researched article, I think it's 130 pages, was published in a peer-reviewed journal of vaccine theory, practice, and research. So this came out in September of
2022.
22, yeah, in September of 22. And the shockwaves went around the globe. And I was one of the people who absolutely I could not believe the evidence you collected. What was also interesting is that you just presented the visual and scientific information from 16 scientific groups around the world and put it in the peer-reviewed article. And you said, this is part one. And I've been waiting for part two. Part two never came out, but the book came out.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit, was it hard to publish this article, and what happened to volume two?
Well, yeah, I mean, so this was September 2022, and I've been very busy since working on the book, of course, which has taken up really all of my time. In addition, some of the questions I intended to get into in part two of this article are in fact explored in chapter 8 of the book. And a further complicating factor is that the more you look into these shots, the more and more questions there are to be asked about them. And there are really no satisfactory answers at this stage. So an awful lot of claims are being made about what they contain and what their purpose is, etc. But it's very difficult to arrive at a definitive answer. So in that respect, it's proven a bit more complex than I was anticipating. But yeah, I mean, really, the credit for this article should go to the 26 research teams and researchers that undertook the primary empirical investigations at the time when it mattered. So I present the findings of those teams from, I think, 16 different countries, 4 different continents, all around the world. And they're working largely independently of one another, and yet they all converge on fairly similar findings, which have to do with a raft of undisclosed ingredients in the shots, which apparently include self-assembling technologies, EMF responsive technologies, heavy metals that shouldn't be present, very peculiar and very complex geometric structures, ribbons, potential carbon nano tubes, potential nano dots. I mean, this is quite exotic technology that we appear to be looking at. Again, no one's quite sure exactly what it is. But the point is that when you understand that there is all of this stuff in there, nobody gave their informed consent to that. So that's why I call this a global crime against humanity. It's one massive violation of the Nuremberg Code, which has been rolled out worldwide. It's a truly shocking event.
That's true. Thanks to your work and people like Sasha Ledipova, now we realize that this was not a pandemic. This was a military operation. And the more we realize that, the easier we can make certain conclusions about it. And it gives a certain explanation about the content of a vaccine, or, for example, things like PCR tests. I live in the United States. I don't have access to the vaccines. But the very first time I heard that the similar particles, similar structures were found in dental anesthetics. One of my present specialties in endocrinology and hematology that I specialized in back in the former USSR. And it's slightly different. Most people do dark microscopy. I do phase contrast microscopy, which has certain features that can collaborate the findings of in the dark field technology. So I joined the team with David Nixon, collaborated with him, collaborated with Alan Mihalicha. So I became one of the micronauts of this international team. It really helped me to understand what's going on. So I found it in dental anesthetics. I found it in regular pharmaceuticals, insulin, but I also found it in the PCR tests. And I don't know if you mentioned it anywhere. I know you talk a lot about PCR tests, and we'll be talking about it. I want to hear your explanation why it was so wrong, why it was a weapon of fear and deception. But I don't think you mentioned any microscopy work done with PCR.
That's correct. I don't discuss that in actually any of my work so far. So that is a current blind spot. I do talk about the PCR tests in this book, as you say, as instruments of fear, as part of the psychological warfare. In my next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, which comes out next month, I discuss the PCR tests in relation to a possible project to try and harvest everybody's genetic data, which makes sense in a totalitarian context, particularly if you know the history of Nazi Germany. But you're right, I haven't looked at the potential for nanotech to be in the swabs themselves, but it would make a good deal of sense because, as you say, the real value of the work of David Nixon and Anna Mihalcha, Carl Coronis, and yourself and others has been to expose the fact that whatever this stuff is, it seems to be in virtually everything now. So we are dealing with a kind of massive environmental contamination where it seems to be very hard to get away from this. And if, as I contend in the book, the transhumanist age that we're moving into, or what in military terms is called an IT bio-nano era, is fundamentally about connecting human beings to via technologies in their bodies to forms of external control grids, then to have the entire environmental landscape saturated in whatever this is, again, makes a certain degree of sense. I mean, if you think about smart dust, for example, and its alleged ability to kind of, fall everywhere, communicate with itself, and quite literally be able to map out a landscape, the potential for social control in all of this is absolutely gigantic. So yeah, so why push the PCR tests and the swab tests so hard? And of course, they go right into that area of the head, which is very close to the brain. So it's very, very invasive. Certainly not safe to administer it en masse in the way that it was being administered. So huge amounts of questions to be asked there. And of course, there's also issues around the kind of capitalist aspect of it and the scams that went on there as well. All in all, a very ugly business.
I agree. We will have a chance to look at some PCR microscopy images at the very end. So before we get into the nitty gritty of the book, and I really do want to get into the details because they're fascinating. I want to ask you, was there any backlash after you published this article and then after you published the book?
In a word, no. um, so the way things seem to work in academia is through forms of intellectual ostracization. So, um, for example, in 2020, I published an article about the events of 9/11. And in a sense, it was quite a simple article. It said, here's a ton of evidence which obviously contradicts the official account of 9/11, yet academics haven't addressed it in almost 20 years. Why not? Here are some potential explanations. And by the way, you really should. You really should, for very strong intellectual and moral reasons. And 4 years later, that article has received no formal reply from any academic anywhere in the world, despite the fact that tens of thousands of people have read it on the publisher's paid website, which, that would be mostly university libraries and hence academics. accessing it. So it's a very highly read article, and yet academia refuses to engage with that issue. Similarly, here with this paper on the vaccines, the response has been a deafening silence. And one academic, unknown to me before, emailed me and said that he had sent the paper round to 70 or 80 academic colleagues. And the only response that he got was an email to say, please take me off this mailing list. So it's quite incredible, the kind of the psychological conditioning and training that must go into that for such a thing to be possible. Because what we're dealing with in this paper that you have up on screen here, this is primary empirical evidence. There's 130 pages of it. This isn't me making stuff up. This is actual microscopic and spectroscopic imagery and analysis from 26 different researchers and research teams. That evidence kind of stands for itself. Now, some of it you might want to question the techniques that some of the microscopists used, but many of these scientists that I cite have decades of experience, for example, in hematology and looking at blood, and they claim that they've never seen such things in all of their career. So there's a lot of hard evidence here, but academia refuses to address it. And so similarly, my book has now been out for almost 1 month. And so far, I haven't really heard a pip from any academics anywhere. 28,000 views on the publisher's official site alone. But at the moment, no pushback.
In other words, silence.
Mhm.
That's very interesting. When I speak about this paper or I speak about the elements of targeting programs, which is they overlap, I will show how they might be interrelated. So there are really three categories of people. The first one just rejects it, doesn't want to hear about it, just like I said, take me off the list, don't want to hear about it. And then the second part says, okay, let me look at your evidence. And then they pull something like Occam's razor and say, well, so we see the structures, but most likely they're just contaminants. And there's nothing to see it. And then there's a third, the smallest group of people who actually engage with the evidence as scientists. Because Occam's razor is not a scientific method. Occam's razor is a philosophical principle of thinking about hypotheses, but that's not the way to solve which one is true. So these are three categories for me, and I recognize it when I talk to people.
Yeah, and another way of thinking about those three categories, there's an independent researcher in England called Andrew Johnson. He's done some great work around 9/11. But he has a memorable way of putting it. He says essentially what you have is the kind of official version of events, and then you have the official approved alternative version of events, and then you have the truth. So the first category that you described is for the normies and those who suffer from cognitive dissonance and do not want to look and will not look and cannot look and are psychologically incapacitated from looking. The second group of people are often rounded up by that kind of official approved alternative version of the truth. And I believe that this is planted deliberately very often by military intelligence operations in order to be able to kind of gather up those people who do know that the official version is false. And it presents them with an alternative version that makes them feel like they're being critical and challenging and so on, but which nevertheless is still false. So in this case, for example, all of the talk around the spike proteins, for example, being the kind of major danger. So it keeps everything in the kind of pharmaceutical paradigm. And as long as you're in that pharmaceutical paradigm, you will never see the potential military dimension of these injections. But of course, when you get to that third category that you mentioned, for people who are able to see through both of the first two categories and actually look very rigorously with their own eyes at the primary evidence, then something altogether uglier begins to present itself, and it typically looks like the military operations that it is.
And those are the people that usually become targets of clandestine operations,
Mm,
either defame them
yeah,
or make them social pariahs,
yeah,
or sometimes even worse measures, like people
yeah. So
have
if I
been
could just jump in, and sorry, Len, to interrupt, but I mean, this is quite an important topic, even as we're speaking. Um, there's been some very good work done by, for example, a chap in England called Alex Creel, goes by the name of Thinking Slow, around the kind of official approved supposed dissidents who are no such thing. And the way that you can recognize them is that they never touch the key issues. They're always late to arrive to the key controversies, and they are relentlessly promoted. All of the propaganda works their way. They have huge platforms, huge readerships and numbers of viewers. They're promoted by Twitter and Facebook and everything, and their faces are everywhere. And it's very interesting because there does seem to be a whole network of these characters. Amazing Polly has also done some interesting work around these networks. Marianne Finch as well is working to expose them. I think Mike Yeadon at the moment is also being quite vocal in his criticism of some of those who are, again, still within that pharmaceutical paradigm that I mentioned, and the doctors who are received praise for the early treatments that they were advocating. But again, if my position and Yeadon's position is correct, all of that is essentially a decoy, and we should be under no illusion that camouflage and decoying are well-known, long-standing military tactics. So again, it's consistent with military operations. Now, in contrast, the third group that you and I are evidently in, this is the group that gets targeted. This is the group where careers are lost, where hit pieces are written against, and indeed, as you know from personal experience, much worse besides. So I think what's starting to emerge is the way this game is played and the way these structures work. That the majority of society falls into camp one and just goes along with the groupthink. There's a space in camp two for some people who understand that camp one is wrong, but it's tightly controlled. And camp three is essentially just persecuted for
that's
telling the truth.
yeah, that's a very important point, and it would help you. This framework that you laid out would help people to understand what's really going on and ask a question: which group am I in? I would like to show our viewers the 8 chapters of your new book, and we'll discuss most important content of these chapters. I will tell you that the first time I read this book, I did a search for certain terms, and the first chapter that I read was chapter number 8, sorry, number 8, where you are talking about the progress in IT, bio, neurotech, and neuro weapons. And then I read the rest of the book, having that possibility, and I would say reality, in mind. We live in this time when, for the first time, it's not just propaganda. We've been exposed to propaganda, all our lives. This time it's different because the interaction between people who manipulate us and our brain became direct. This is qualitatively different time. This is why it's different. This is why this time it's not going to end well for humanity. Allow me to show some of the stuff from the last chapter. You talking about the covert installation of military hardware into human bodies, the IT bio nano era. And I pulled some quotes that really stood out to me because it confirmed my understanding and it really echoed my thoughts.
The first thing to say regarding both of these quotes, and indeed much of chapter 8, is that I'm not making any hard or definitive claims about exactly what is going on, because I don't know for sure what this tech is. I don't know for sure what exactly was in the shots. However, when you put it all in context, there is reason to be extremely concerned and to ask some very serious questions. So this possibility here in the quote that you have just read, I'm writing in relation to Elon Musk and Neuralink at this point. And as so often with transhumanism, it's often sold in this kind of slightly kooky, geeky, kind of sci-fi, not very realistic, maybe futuristic, maybe someday kind of way. And his idea of, inserting a chip into the brain, and you kind of see pictures of how this would work. And, a circular shaped hole has to be drilled into the skull and so on, which is all, this is very old kind of technology to do that. And so the public is being presented with an image that this kind of technology, even if it were possible, is still some distance in the future and would rely on an alleged visionary like Elon Musk to bring it about with his fortune. But what I present in chapter 8 is a mountain really of evidence that far more advanced technologies have been developed deliberately since at least the turn of the millennium, when the vision appeared in various military and government documents in the US regarding what they called at the time the IT bio-nano era. And in very simple terms, what this means is the ability to connect human bodies to some form of external network using bio-nanotechnology that goes into the body, and the IT aspect is communicating with the network. So it's typically sold to us in terms of perhaps being able to one day help with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Often it's framed in terms of cures for cancer and so on, or non-invasive surgery. And all of these things, of course, would be wonderful and praiseworthy if that was fundamentally what this was about. But the argument that I make all throughout the book is that everything that's been taking place under the banner of public health is really a camouflage. It's a decoy. It's a disguise. And what this really is a deep state military operation. So when you see it all in its proper context, there are very good reasons to think that much more advanced technologies developed particularly with relation to DARPA, another kind of military research agency, which of course was working closely with Moderna, and then it feeds all the way through into the so-called mRNA vaccines, which may well be nothing of the kind for all we know. These are the kinds of conversations which now need to be had. And again, it's really only those of us in Camp 3 that are able to have these conversations at present.
I have a question for you. You think this started happening on the mass scale in 2020? One of your quotes is the Omni War started in 2020. But don't you think that this technology has been in testing for a long, long time? And if so, how do you think it was tested?
I do think it's been in progress for a long time. Again, when you look at the literature around this, which I explore in chapter 8, you're looking at a good 2 decades at least before 2020. What's also worth noting is that when you go back to, for example, a NASA document from 2001 that I cite, it lays out a timeline that features the years 2020, 2025, 2030. A document from, I think it was the National Science Foundation and the Department of Commerce in 2002, talking again about this IT bio-nano era, identifies, guess when, 2020, that exact year. There's a document which I and 2 co-authors, Dan Brody and Lissa Johnson, refer to in our 4-part series on transhumanism, which is currently being published in Propaganda in Focus, propagandainfocus.com. You can access it there. We discuss a document called Proteus from 2008. And that again, it outlines a vision of a rolling series of pandemics that lead into the year, guess when? 2020. So, when you put it all together, there does appear to have been a timeline in place already. Now, this is only the literature which is publicly available. And one of the points I also make in chapter 8 is, what about the black technology? What about the technology that we don't know about? So there was a Harvard, I think it was a philosopher of science by the name of Peter Gallison, way back in 2004. He made the observation that actually most scientific research is classified. The majority is classified. So therefore, kind of we in the public live in a state of ignorance, really, regarding what is or is not technologically possible. Because in terms of publicly available science, we often just don't know. And in that regard, I would just throw in a side note to Judy Wood and Where Did the Towers Go? And whatever kind of technology was used to destroy the Twin Towers clearly seems to have been some kind of black technology. So when you know that they are operating in these kinds of ways, as I say, the publicly available literature goes back roughly to the turn of the millennium, but it could go back even further, for all we know, in terms of military planning. In chapter 1, I talk about the fact that, my contention that the ruling classes of the world have known since 1968 at least that ultimately the only way of preserving their rule will be to unite and form a global or a world state, which will amount to a form of global scientific dictatorship. And that's precisely what we're seeing trying to be installed at the moment. So in that regard, you could go back to the mid-20th century in terms of the fundamental class logic behind all of this. Now, of course, all of this will have been developed behind the scenes. And of course, the deception is fundamental to all of this attack on the public. So the public will be the last to find out, as indeed it was. And then all of a sudden in 2020, bam, the most vicious, ferocious, comprehensive psychological operation of all time, directed against the publics of multiple countries transnationally to completely debilitate and disorientate and demoralize them, all for what? So this is the thing. Once you understand that this was a psychological operation, and that's what Volume 1 and indeed Volume 2 are trying to prove in some detail, and you understand the history of psychological operations and psychological warfare, it's typically the prelude to physical warfare, and something much, much worse. So given that this has just been done to us, it begs the question of what they intend to come next. And I think it's total technocratic totalitarianism and potentially biodigital human enslavement.
Well said. David, I would like to put this concept, this hypothesis on the table that yes, this technology did not come out of nowhere. There were decades of research and research on real people because these are cognitive weapons. They work with the central nervous system of humans. Therefore, you cannot test on animals.
Yeah,
So,
could I just interject again quickly
yes,
there?
yes.
I mean, you suddenly, you make me think, of course, all the way back to the MK Ultra experiments, which were primarily psychological. But it is known, for example, that in 1962, the CIA explored the possibility in one of its sub-projects, I think it was sub-project 119, of remote control human beings. So that was a thing back in the 1960s. And as I discuss in chapter 8, you can then follow that through kind of Jose Delgado and the stymosievers implanted in bulls to be able to stop a charging bull and so on. That was all being done in the 60s and the 70s. So here we are half a century later. How much further will they have got with that kind of technology?
It's incredible we're thinking along the same lines because I put exactly that quote when you, once again, in chapter 8, you're talking about the evil potential of weaponized neurotechnology. My point is that this human experimentation to finesse technology, to see how it works in real life, it's been done for a long time. And there's a group of people all over the world who call themselves targeted individuals. They make exactly the same claims that they're surveilled, they're biosurveilled, their thoughts are read and communicated back via so-called technology, something called V2K, voice to skull. When a person hears voices, can receive communication, and nobody around them hears the same thing. And it's often being presented as a psychiatric disease, but there are about 17 different methods to deliver voice to human central nervous system, and it's not an acoustic signal, because if it was, people around target individuals will also hear that. So I think that this is a culmination of decades of research on unconsensual targeted individuals. The name of our podcast is the same name of our lawsuit, Targeted Justice v. Garland. So we actually found a mechanism how people are enrolled into this program. After 9/11, there was a presidential order to create a terror screening database. It was delegated to the FBI, and FBI was only supposed to have two categories in it: known and suspected terrorists. But they went ahead and took advantage of it and created two additional secret categories, which is known as handling code 3 and 4. They are people who meet certain secret criteria. Congress never approved it. It actually contains 97% of the terror screening database. So there's about 1.6 million people worldwide that are in the database, according to Attorney General audits, that have nothing to do with terrorism, nothing to do with national security. They're just there because they put them there. And this is what the lawsuit is about.
That all
So,
makes a good deal of sense. Sorry, go ahead.
yes, so, but that's on the legal part. Today we're talking about the scientific principles and scientific possibilities. And I think about scientific reality, because this went beyond just hypothesizing. You talk about brain-computer interface, and as your quote on the previous page said, every time you see an article in the popular literature, you see this inevitable image of somebody wearing a helmet or wearing multiple connectors. There's a perception, they build that perception that the only way to communicate with brain in and out, to create that bidirectional connection, is to install something physically, macro implant. But the technology, the real technology, the classified technology, is never being exposed. And that's a common argument for the group number two. They agree on certain things, but then they say, well, where's the information? Well, the information is classified. So that's the end of the conversation for them. So, do you have any comments about target individual group? Have you been exposed to it? I know it's big in UK, it's big in the United States, it's big in Europe. There are various organizations fighting for their rights, but it's like fighting to dismantle the CIA.
Right. So I'm really glad that you bring this up. This is something that I very nearly included in the book, but I just felt that I didn't have the necessary expertise to really comment on it properly. So I mean, there are certain things that we do know, much as that, a lot of it is classified. But I mean, the V2K stuff, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't that deployed against Iraqi soldiers in one of the two wars against Iraq?
Yes,
Um, so I mean, we know this, right? And I mean, that was, if it was 2003, that's still 2 decades ago, and if it was 1991, even longer. So this much we know. So we know that these kinds of technologies do exist, and we also know that they love to, wherever possible, be able to kind of pilot new technologies and test them out and so on in various different ways, kind of almost like an experimentation, if you like. Furthermore, it's interesting that you bring up the terrorist list, because one of the other points I make in the book, or one of the arguments I make, is that what was put in place, the architecture of oppression that was put in place under the banner of the war on terror, ostensibly in the name of fighting terrorism, all, of course, based on the myth of what happened on 9/11. Now that Western societies have allowed that to be rolled out, almost at the flick of a switch, the terms can be changed, and you just have to replace the word terrorist with dissident or anything else that you might prefer. And you're right that we see the CIA. I mean, it's broader than that. I refer to it as the transnational deep state, operating completely outside of the rule of law, completely outside of democracy, oversight, and accountability. So when you look at it that way, it comes as no surprise to me that there will be a list of, did you say 1,600 names? That
no, 1.6 million worldwide.
Sorry, right. Much worse then. 1.6 million names of people who could essentially be the targets for these kinds of experiments to establish the feasibility of this technology and to calibrate it. And I mean, similarly, it's of great interest to me that the bad batch phenomenon with the vaccines. This cannot possibly be simply down to bad manufacturing. You mentioned Sasha Latipova. She's done good work around this, as have many others. But when you see it as a military operation, you have to be wondering, are they calibrating some kind of weapon now? Are they calibrating particular levels of tolerance of different groups to, different levels of whatever is put in the shots? So, particularly in my next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State, I've got a long section in there about the history of experimentation on human beings. Again, you typically think back to Nazi Germany and the concentration camps when you say that, but actually during the Cold War and beyond, a long history of the military, for example, conducting nuclear tests on human beings, spraying them with deadly, not well, sometimes deadly, but certainly dangerous chemicals from the skies or in subways, and on it goes. So we know that for decades the military has essentially seen the public as objects of experimentation for its weaponry, and therefore none of this should come as any surprise. It all fits together and all makes sense in terms of the bigger jigsaw that we're piecing together here.
True. What do you think about the MAC address technology, MAC address emission phenomenon? Because to
Mm.
me, that's one of the better proofs or better evidence supporting the fact that a technology able to emit a digitally formatted signal in a specific range is installed into human beings. And I will admit, and I admitted on various shows, that I personally emit a MAC address. We're biologically analog. Whatever we emit should not be digitally formatted into a hexadecimal number.
I'm really glad you bring this up, Len. I'm enormously interested in this because it's a potential way of proving that this is going on. Now, I'm also deeply frustrated because after 3 years of these claims being made, as far as I know, there haven't been any adequately powered studies conducted to actually test whether or not this is a reality. So there are plenty of people such as yourself making these claims, and that's enough in and of itself to raise serious concerns. I'm sure many of your viewers will have seen the videos that have gone around online, showing, as you say, the mysterious hexadecimal addresses, which seem to pop up in peculiar circumstances, or being available on aeroplanes, for example, out of range from transmitters on the ground. All of these things need looking into, and we need proper experiments to be done into this, because this is empirically testable. So we can move clean out of the realm of, so-called conspiracy theory, or flights of fancy, or whatever the skeptics might want to label us as. And this should be actually demonstrable. And it's been one of my real frustrations over the last 3 years that no one is doing this work. No scientists, no scientific teams are actually doing this properly. So there was one group in France, Sarlangay, I think, Sarlang. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. I think he may be Argentinian. But the experiment itself was conducted in France in 2021, and they went to a remote location, and scanned, first of all, a group of vaccinated people, and then a group of unvaccinated people, having them kind of approach the scanner from a distance. And as they got closer and closer, it turned out that none of the unvaccinated gave off a signal, but 40% of the vaccinated did. So you have a significant difference there. Now, it wasn't 100% of the vaccinated, but nevertheless, that the fact that none of the unvaccinated did and 40% of the vaccinated did, that should be enough to warrant further investigation. They then took the groups, different groups, again, vaccinated and unvaccinated people, to, or was it just the vaccinated this time? I forget, to troglodyte caves, which they were using as Faraday cages, essentially. And still, a couple of the vaccinated people were giving out signals there. I think it was 2 out of 14. So it might not sound a lot, but it does warrant further investigation. Now, there's a researcher in this country called Richard D. Hall. He did do a serious experiment into this. I think he got 10, or was it 12 vaccinated people, and he built a Faraday cage of his own, and stuck them in that Faraday cage and tested them. And it turned out that none of them were giving off signals within the Faraday cage. So at that point, you might think, well, maybe it's not a real phenomenon. But the question is this kind of technology, does it only activate when in the presence of EMF? In which case, the Hall experiment doesn't actually show us anything in that regard. I'm also in touch with another researcher called David Ferguson, who is a software engineer, and has a great deal of expertise. It goes way over my head in terms of these so-called MAC addresses and Bluetooth signals. He really knows the computer software aspect of it inside out. And he too is skeptical of the phenomenon, and he thinks that in the French experiment, it could well have been the case that MAC addresses that were being emitted from large distances away were nevertheless being picked up by the signal detectors. So, so the point is here, there is kind of evidence both ways when we look at this phenomenon. But the key thing is, it is empirically testable. So where are the scientific research teams? Please, can we just put this to bed? Please, can a scientifically competent group of people design an adequate experiment with proper controls, recruit the relevant people into the relevant groups, and carry this out in a rigorous way? Because we have to get to the bottom of this. So on the one hand, maybe it's not a thing. Who knows? You are evidently sure that it is. If an experiment proves that it's not, then okay, that's a finding. But the thing is, what happens if you're proven to be right, Len? What happens if a serious experiment is done and it turns out that there is some kind of signal being given off by vaccinated people. I mean, or even unvaccinated people. I mean, this would be profoundly worrying. We also have to remember, of course, the so-called magnet gate phenomenon of 2021, where many people who had taken a shot found themselves turning magnetic. Now, that should not be explainable within the terms of the disclosed ingredients of the so-called vaccines. And again, you can find video after video after video of people kind of sticking spoons and keys to themselves, particularly around the injection site. And we know that that shouldn't be taking place. We know that that's not organic or biological. You know, that's obviously something wrong. Of course, all the fact checkers try to just dismiss it as crazy, etc. But again, look with your own eyes, use your own common sense. There's something clearly not right about that. So yeah, so I'm absolutely fascinated by this issue. I can't tell you whether or not it's real, but I would really urge any serious scientist out there to get involved in this kind of research and help us to find the answers to this once and for all.
Very good point. And it's not some esoteric issue. It concerns all of us. It concerns the health of human beings, the entire human race.
Yes, and I mean fundamentally, I mean it could blow
It
the
is
lid off the entire
exactly.
thing. You know,
Yeah,
if the kinds of claims and arguments that I'm making in this book are just, you know, too much for people and they think it's just completely crazy or whatever because, you know, they've not done the work themselves. You know, if it can be concretely demonstrated on this issue, then really it becomes very clear what's taken place here, and there'd be scientific proof of it. That's why it's imperative to do this research.
I totally agree. Let's move on. Now we're reading the book from its beginning. So you announced this concept of World War III that we're already in. This echoes an opinion of other experts on so-called 5G warfare that we are already in a war, but the nature of it is that we don't know who is attacking us, how they're attacking us, and whether we're attacked at all. And the words that I highlighted, that at this time in this war that is going on, there's a novel biodigital form of totalitarianism that threatens to lead the irreversible enslavement of humanity. This is why this time it is qualitatively different.
Right. So this is the first sentence of the book, and it packs a punch on purpose. What chapter one seeks to do is to expose the fundamental class relations that are behind all of this, which is why the phrase global class war appears within the first five words of the book, because that's fundamentally what we're dealing with. So the argument that I make is that the purpose of this global class war is to collapse liberal democracy and the old paradigm of social control as it has existed since, say, at least 1945, is no longer fit for purpose, and replace it with a new form of social control, which will be global technocracy. Now, to do this on a worldwide scale is a feat of social engineering that is challenging beyond belief. And when you look back previously in history, um, it requires world war to effect this level of deep-rooted social transformation. So when we're talking about the so-called Great Reset, for example, you know, what that's really referring to is a kind of top-down technocratic remaking of society in a totalitarian image. So we need to be clear here that what the transnational ruling class is seeking to achieve is a form of totalitarianism. As I argue in my next book, the whole way of trying to achieve this is modeled on what took place in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, and indeed it's many of the same actors still involved as were involved back then. So totalitarianism for well over a century has been regarded as the most brutal, ruthless, but also efficient means of keeping the working class in check. So now that we've entered a very precarious moment in world history, where the old paradigm of order is completely coming apart and indeed is being demolished on purpose, this new paradigm that they wish to issue in is biodigital this time. So this is what's new about it. So in many ways, we see many of the old hallmarks of totalitarianism in terms of kind of mounting censorship and eugenics experiments, euthanasia coming back, and all of these kinds of dark symptoms. Again, I've got the whole list of them in chapter 2 of the next book. But what is new about this is the biodigital aspect. And so we're dealing here with smart technologies in particular, and technocracy in a very simple sense is the scientific management of everyone and everything. And it amounts to a form of dictatorship, because if you can monitor what everybody and everything is doing at all times, and you have all of that data, then you can completely order society in the way that you wish. So there'll be an elite group at the top, the global technocrats, and they will essentially have total control over everything. So when we link this back to our earlier discussion about what exactly is in the shots and the questions to be asked there, around the IT bio-nano era, around the pushing of transhumanism and so on, it seems very much to me, again, in very simple terms here, that the project fundamentally involves connecting human beings biodigitally to an external network, which will then be able in time to control them completely. And at that stage, we would be looking at human enslavement, the return of slavery, but this time in a form which potentially could be irreversible, because if this system is allowed to entrench itself, how is it ever going to be thwarted or overthrown?
Interesting. When I'm reading this paragraph and when I'm listening to what you have to say, this is going to lead to dissolvement of sovereign countries, because there will be a global biodigital uh, totalitarianism. Is that a correct conclusion, that individual sovereign countries will basically disappear? So, in a way, this war is also waged against the governments.
Yeah, well, governments everywhere, in my opinion, have been infiltrated, and they're now all of them controlled at higher levels. The policies are not formulated by governments; they're formulated by think tanks and organizations like the World Economic Forum and so on, and international organizations like the WHO with the pandemic treaty at the moment. It's all coming very much top down. Governments are just mere implementers. Politicians are evidently just puppets at this stage. There's no true democracy in any meaningful sense. We've seen this over and over again during the so-called pandemic years. In this country, the government and many of the senior advisors in March 2020 were saying, no, 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 we're never going to lock down. We're never going to lock down. And then all of a sudden they lock down. And as I argue in the book, this is evidence of the transnational deep state interfering at a key moment, vetoing everything that's normally going on, declaring the state of emergency. And the next thing you know, you've got this incredible behavior happening. Similarly, the politicians in this country, I mean, Parliament voted to approve every renewal of the Coronavirus Act. I mean, just full of the most tyrannical measures you can imagine. At one point, it didn't even bother voting to renew it. It was just kind of taken as a given that this would happen. It voted through mandatory vaccines for care home workers and so on. I mean, just repeated betrayals of the public, repeated betrayals of liberty. And so really you see, much as in Nazi Germany, and again, this is argued in the next book, that kind of structures persist, parliaments persist and so on, but they're just kind of almost like ghost structures. They don't have any real meaning or power relative to the much broader structures that sit above them. So will things necessarily suddenly look hugely different? You're right that an overriding of national sovereignty is required, but it may still be the case that people still think that they, live in a country called, say, England. Maybe they still remember certain traditions, but even all of that is under attack as well. And what they're trying to achieve here with this global technocracy involves ultimately the erasure of nationalities, the erasure of freedom. In that sense, it's kind of antithetical to anything that liberals and conservatives believe. I mean, it's a ridiculously audacious project, what they are attempting here, and that's why so much force is being deployed, and it's why the events of the last few years have been so thoroughly unpleasant for everybody.
Let's move on to 5G warfare and omnivore. You suggested the term omnivore as a sort of substitute, as a better term for fifth generation warfare. I think both terms have its own value. The fifth
Yes.
generation warfare is valuable to single out because of the unique domain of that warfare, which is human cognition. But it
Yeah.
doesn't mean that other methods would not be used in conjunction with it. This bio nano enhanced propaganda, when you can not only distribute propaganda, but you can influence how it's received by the public on the large scale. What are your main arguments for using omnivore versus fifth generation warfare?
Yes, I mean, I think fifth generation warfare certainly has some value as a concept, and primarily in terms of what it gets at, in terms of people being undeclared combatants in a war without even realizing it. So they don't even realize that war is being waged against them and that it's going on all the time. This is a really important insight. Um, Now, one of the things about the 5GW literature, when you read up on it, there seems to be quite a lot of conceptual confusion around. It's become a little bit kind of grey, a little bit messy in that regard. And again, what I really want to kind of drive home in this opening chapter is the class dimension of everything that's happening. And for me, fifth generation warfare doesn't really do that adequately. So, for example, I've read claims that China is now trying to wage fifth generation warfare against the US, and maybe not. But the point is, you're still operating in these kind of nation state versus nation state paradigms. Whereas what we're really looking at here is a transnational ruling class waging war vertically, if you like, against the populations of all countries, particularly in the West. So the way that this war is being conducted, and it follows from the logic of the war itself, in which the few have chosen to wage war against the many. I mean, it sounds like a preposterous proposition on its face, but when you tease out the logic of it explains a lot of what's going on. So the war is being waged for technocracy. The goal, the aim of the war is to collapse liberal democracy and institute global technocracy. Now, in order to do that, you have to essentially defeat the public will to resist and find ways of getting this through, regardless of whether or not the public wants it or even realizes what's happening. So a lot of it involves deception. But the way it's working, in my view, is that war is being waged against populations in every conceivable domain. So this is why it looks so different from what's come before. In my book, I talk all about the different methods of psychological warfare, for example. We've also discussed today some of the neuroscience and neurotech that, as James Giordano so delightfully puts it at West Point, the brain is the 21st century battlescape. That's his words, not mine. So that's a straight admission there from a Pentagon neuroscience advisor that 21st century warfare will be waged in the brain. But we can look way beyond there. If you look at the field of journalism, for example, Whitney Webb has written about how journalism has just become a kind of form of information warfare these days. The high levels of inflation everywhere and the cost of living crisis, in my opinion, are non-accidental and are a form of economic warfare, which again has been seen in the past in various CIA operations, means of punishing the public and giving them so much to worry about. They can't be looking at these kind of bigger picture dimensions. There's clear war against the food supply at the moment when you look at the destruction of all of these food facilities. There's war on Christian values, very obviously, through all forms of mass manufactured culture. I mean, the list really goes on and on and on. In the UK in 2024, I've barely seen the sun. It's been out for maybe a few days, and here we are in mid-May. So what's going on with the weather? Of course, there's widespread suspicion now, based on all of the lines in the skies and so on, which are, everybody's seeing them. Everyone's posting them up on social media. Again, unless you're heavily propagandized, if you have the ability to use your own eyes and your own five senses and to think for yourself, then it's pretty clear that there's something very suspicious going on there. So potential kind of weather modification. And again, you can see how this could be weaponized. Maybe they're spraying chemicals. Maybe it's something to do with smart dust. Who knows? Maybe it's just to kind of keep the population depressed, and because it's not getting enough sunshine and vitamin D and so on. Who knows? But the point is, everywhere you turn, everything's being weaponized. Entire academic disciplines seem to be just rolling over and serving power. You find the legal profession coming up with pretexts to justify mandatory vaccination, when an absolute form of tyranny. Software engineers coming up with ways of developing ever more efficient algorithms to help social media kind of root out and censor dissident voices and so on. Everywhere you look, everywhere, this war is being waged. And it's very clever because typically it does all it can to remain invisible, so that the public doesn't get wise to the scale or the nature or the purpose of what is taking place. And again, I think that's a deliberate tactic here. But, if your viewers and listeners are wondering why their life has not improved since 2020, and I am willing to wager that very few of their lives have significantly improved since 2020, this is the reason. Because in every sphere of life now, things are being deliberately made harder. And that's even before we get on to the so-called vaccines and the massive harms that they've done, and the highly distressing videos circulating all over the internet of vaccine injured people. It's before we even discuss the excess mortality rates, which have been consistently high all across the West since 2021. This war metaphor, it's not just a metaphor; it's an accurate description. And when you find characters like Bill Gates, Klaus Schwab, Kristieva, Georgina Kristieva, is that her name, the IMF lady, director, and they're all talking about, what they're all drawing analogies between the COVID era and World War II. It's pretty clear that they see this in terms of World War. And again, the reason for that is that they're trying to refashion the entire global political economy in a totalitarian image now.
Very interesting explanation and very complete. Before we go into my favorite topics, the PCR test, I want to talk about something that you mentioned. You mentioned James Giordano, who does not shy away from the term mind control. Neither do you. I actually have memorized his quote. He said, he describes existing technology. We're able to read from the brain in real time and write to the brain in real
Mhm.
time. No matter what game, word game you're playing, this is mind control.
Yeah.
So, what kind of relationship do you have with the word mind control? Because public intellectuals, when they hear mind control, they kind of have this childish reaction
Mm.
that very sort of inadequate to the level of their intellectual level. They think it's mind control is roboticize humans, and it's not. Perhaps you can explain why you're comfortable with the word mind control and what is a more sophisticated understanding of it.
Yeah, I mean the kind of public intellectual that you're describing there, the reason that they have those attitudes is ironically because they are under a form of mind control themselves. And mind control can be done through various means. I mean, just intense propaganda is enough to literally program most people's minds. So, you know, the television in many ways was the most effective weapon of war developed during the 20th century. The majority of society apparently um, can't think beyond what the mainstream media and politicians tell them. So whatever comes through the television and the radio is fundamentally gospel. So even within academia, for example, Mark Crispin Miller has made this point. You know, he says his colleagues at NYU get their talking points from, say, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, and they have these kind of very kind of, you know, highbrow intellectual discussions about all of this kind of material. And no, we'd never read tabloid newspapers or anything like this. And, you know, they don't realize that they're getting their information from two of the worst kind of propaganda sources of all in the United States. And in many ways, not just academics, but many people are completely ill-equipped to understand and deal with propaganda. Now, in terms coming back to mind control, you know, why is that an appropriate and a useful term? Well, obviously, the MK Ultra program was a mind control program, and what I do in chapters 2 and 3 of the book is to show how experiments that were conducted on individuals in order to gain control of their mind in the mid 20th century have gradually been expanded to groups and even entire societies in order to be able to fundamentally control what people think. This whole idea of strategic narratives that we hear today and controlling the narrative. I mean, this is fundamental now for governments and other ruling power structures. It's all about controlling what people think. And, you know, Winston Churchill said back in the 1940s, you know, the next empires will be empires of the mind. They knew all this. And of course, it makes sense when the formal era of imperialism was, well, nominally ending as, you know, among third world nationalism and states achieving political independence and so on. Of course, forms of imperialism persisted beyond that, I mean, particularly economically. But this empires of the mind concept, I think, is a really interesting one because it circles back to that question again: how is it possible to control so many people when it's such a minuscule number of people proportionately who control the levers of power and all of the means of production? So I think that mind control is far more powerful than the average person would ever imagine. Most of us labor under forms of mind control without even knowing it. So, in my own case, for example, I didn't, you know, wake up in inverted commas until December 2016. Yeah, I spent 15 years after 9/11 completely asleep and, you know, having no idea about any of the kind of things that I've researched and am now presenting today. And that's understandable because if you grow up and you've been heavily propagandized to believe that, you know, you live in a great democracy and that you're free and that your vote matters and that, you know, Western civilization is such a great thing and blah, 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 blah. And no one says otherwise. And there's no serious challenge to it in mainstream anything. Of course, you'll believe that, and you're essentially kind of programmed that way. It takes a lot of conscientious, kind of hard work, often self work, and doing the research independently and putting the pieces together independently and learning to think for yourself to be able to see this and to be able to challenge the programming. And so all of that, everything I've just described, works purely at the psychological level. I mean, presumably it also has kind of chemical impacts in the brain as well, but it's primarily psychological. But one of the key kind of discussion points that we've had has been what is now taking place or has been taking place since 2020. Are they looking now for more direct neurological forms of control? Are they looking for ways of getting technologies into people's brains? And I discuss this in chapter 8, for example. Charles Lieber developed a 1 centimeter squared neural net, which he could get onto the brain of a mouse through a syringe. I think that was 2019. So a syringe injectable neural net. The prospects are pretty terrifying when you consider everything in the round. The rapid development of graphene and graphene oxide, incredible new technology, new substance, first discovered in 2004, only 1 atom thick, so essentially 2D, has all of these remarkable properties, much stronger than steel, could be made superconductive, etc., etc. You have companies like, I think it's called In-Brain Electronics, trying to use graphene to be able to develop these neural nets to go onto and into brains. Again, it would be wonderful if all of this were just being done to cure Parkinson's, etc. But you have to take seriously, in the military context that I have provided, the idea that this can indeed be used to gain direct access to people's brains. Klaus Schwab himself at the World Economic Forum has talked all about this. Being able to just see directly into people's brains could be used for kind of pre-crime purposes in the WEF's eyes. They've been talking about this quite openly for years. So if anybody thinks that it's crazy, again, just listen to the pronouncements of the key players here. All of this is very, very troubling, in my opinion. And if this push for technocracy continues, and they are indeed able to get these kinds of technologies into the brain, past the blood-brain barrier. This is why the nano component of all of this is so important, incidentally, because at the nanoscale, you can pass the blood-brain barrier. It's really dystopian. And this is why I'm doing the best I can to try and draw as many people's attention to this as I can, because it isn't just, crazy nonsense. There's a lot of evidence to support this from all kinds of different angles. And I really hope that people take a good look at it.
Yes, I agree. When people say mind control, they don't realize that it's not this comical, movement of the limbs, but it means that they can influence your decision making, manipulate your attitude towards certain ideas, all by direct interaction with the brain using this bio nano technology. And so that makes me wonder how these days, now that we know it's available, I think it's reality. I think it's been rolled out on a large scale. How do you know when it's just propaganda, when you're just exposed to the information, or you're exposed to the information and your brain is influenced to perceive it in a certain way? Where do you draw the line, and how do you know? Because you would not know. You actually, to you, it would appear that this is your own decision.
Yeah, it's a very interesting one. and it's one of the big issues of our time, I think, how to de-propagandize people. And that's why I think a lot of the work that's going on at Propaganda in Focus is extremely valuable, because it's trying to explain the mechanisms through which propaganda works so that the public might be better able to recognize it. And actually, the way it works is often very crude. If it's just by repetition, endless repetition, for example, of particular words and phrases and ideas, then that is a reason to be wary that it could be propaganda. It's propaganda is a one-way form of communication. There's no two-way discussion or dialogue. Propaganda never admits that it's wrong. The truth doesn't mind being questioned, but propaganda does. Propaganda will produce fact checkers and so on, paid by powerful organizations to just relentlessly enforce a narrative. So there are certain telltale signs that you can look out for. Propaganda uses thought-terminating cliches like conspiracy theorist, extremist, anti-vaxxer, anti-Semite, far right. I mean, these become really cliched, worn out, and tired once you understand what they are, but they still have a very powerful effect on most people. So actually, in many ways, once you have even a basic training in propaganda, it becomes easier to discern it and to see how it works, or the way that newspaper headlines might be written, for example, to convey a particular message. And then you read down into the article and there's content there that just contradicts the headline. And you realize that the headline was just there to kind of send a quick kind of message, and that there's actually nothing to it. All of these things people can be on the lookout for, and really need to be on the lookout for now. There was a great quote by the late journalist John Pilger in 2016. It went something along the lines of, in all of my career as a journalist, and by this point he was, I don't know, in his 70s, I think, or late 60s. In all of my career as a journalist, I have never known Western society to be as saturated in propaganda as it is now. And that was a key moment, really, because most people in the West have been trained to think of propaganda as something totalitarian, something that is associated with, let's say, the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany. It would never occur to them that they themselves have been heavily propagandized from birth. So one of the great aspects, really, about what is sometimes referred to as the Great Awakening, which has been radically accelerated since 2020, is that more and more people are starting not only to see it, but to understand how it works and to dissect it and to reject it. So I think that's a positive sign.
That is a positive sign. I welcome that movement. So, in your book, you demonstrate that the pandemic was not really a pandemic, that vaccines were not really vaccines, and that the PCR tests were not really tests, but they were instruments of fear and instruments of deception. There are great details in the PCR chapter about the multiplication. Maybe you can expand like really quickly on that.
Yeah, I mean, these are not my insights. This has been known for several years now, and I've just written it up, really. As you say, there's a great level of detail in the chapter, so I'd encourage people to read chapter 4 of the book. It's backed up by hundreds of references, most of them peer reviewed. Yeah, so the PCR tests, as the inventor of the PCR test, Carrie Mullis, said, they take a bit of something and they multiply it and create kind of more of that something. And this can be very useful for certain purposes, but even he said that they shouldn't really be used to diagnose disease. If you're diagnosing disease, you should start with the symptoms and so on, and then perhaps use a test to see what you can find in terms of viruses and so on. Now, the thing about PCR tests, according to the official guidelines developed by Stephen Bustin and others, is that they should not be run at too high a cycle threshold. So I think every time you run one cycle threshold, I think it doubles. So Bustin was recommending that you should never run it above something like 30, 35 cycles in the cycle threshold. Now, when you look at the official documents from country after country after country, including the WHO, which I present all of this evidence in the chapter, you find that they're all running it at kind of 40 to 45 cycles uh, instead, which is far too sensitive. You're going to get all kinds of false positives. The test is rendered pretty meaningless, really, for scientific purposes. But what it does is it generates so-called cases. So, oh, I've tested positive using a PCR test, and then you're classed as a case of COVID-19. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. First of all, it's testing for SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and not the disease. And this whole nonsense, this whole scientific fraud allows for the concept that people can be walking around with this deadly disease and yet not have any symptoms. So the whole thing is scientifically absurd. And of course, it was never about the science. It was never about public health. It was always to do with ulterior motivations. And two of them you've got up on the screen here to generate fear. That there's all these cases around and all of these people who could potentially kill you just by passing within 6 feet of you. And also as part of the grand theatre that was played out, it was often remarked that if there hadn't been any masks and there hadn't been any testing and there hadn't been people performing these bizarre rituals of standing on stickers apart from each other, there wouldn't have been any evidence of a pandemic because there wasn't one. So these are the true functions, in my view, of the PCR tests.
That's a very good insight. I would also put a hypothesis on the table that the PCR test could also be a delivery method for nanotechnology. So this is my Substack from January 17 of this year. I was interested in, and I realized that everything produced under this military operation was not really tested the way the FDA would test a regular pharmaceutical. And so I found about 8 or 9 brands sold at a drugstore, and they all had the same disclosure. Let me see if I can show you. For use under an emergency use authorization only. At that time, pandemic was already over, and there was no PCR tests that would not have this disclosure. And I have a suspicion that they were coming from all the same place. But look what I found in the swab. I basically took a swab and gently moved it over a drop of saline. And I did control. The saline does contain some interesting structures. Nothing is nanotechnology free anymore, but not at this rate. So these vesicles that contain a lot of technology inside, this is not supposed to be, and this is not a pieces of cotton or anything like that. Moreover, this looks exactly, these geometrical structures, rectangular structures, they look exactly like what we see in technology. I mean, you look at the structures, they're literally chips. And then
Right. So could you just pan up a little bit there, Len? So just again for viewers who may not be so familiar with this kind of thing, I just want to encourage you to look at the detail and the complexity of some of these structures that have formed here. What I find remarkable about these images is how closely they resemble images. You mentioned David Nixon, for example. Some of his images, not only of the COVID vials and what's in them, but also the dental anesthetics and so on. I mean, I'm not an expert in this branch of science, or indeed in any natural science. But I would implore anybody with the relevant expertise to comment on this, particularly the kind of the little donuts embedded within geometric shapes. This is a feature that Nixon's work has showed quite often. And I understand from a whole raft of scientists that I've had discussions with that they didn't used to see this kind of thing before 2021. So the fact that you're now finding such similar structures in the swabs is, again, of great cause for concern.
I agree. This is also something I have not seen before. Look at these clusters of um, material they built up on each other, and these rhomboid shapes, and they always have these rhomboid shapes at the end. And I think this is unique to the swabs. You see this rhomboid structure.
Mm.
That is quite different from what we usually see. And I think it's because of the delivery method, because you're not injecting it into the muscle or the intravenously. It's because you are actually um, um, shoving it and rubbing it against the surface of the inner surface of the brain in the nasal cavity. These are all the topics I wanted to cover. Do you have any additional points that you would like to make? Because there are eight um, chapters. They're all different. They all talk about different aspects. What else is important that you would like to share that we perhaps missed today?
Well, in terms of the book, I mean, some topics that we haven't been over today and don't have the time to do so, but may be of interest to readers. The Tavistock Institute and techniques of shock and stress I deal with in chapter 2. Mary Holland says that anyone who lived through the COVID era could be forgiven for suffering PTSD because what was done to us was really traumatic and by design. So chapter 3 is all about trauma-based mind control. Chapter 4 we've covered part of here in terms of the different methods of creating fear, but it goes far beyond just the tests and the masks. It's a very long chapter. Um, I mean, it was absolutely comprehensive the way they tried to keep the population in a state of fear. Chapter 5 deals with what I call cognitive attack, ways of scrambling cognition so that people can no longer make sense of things. So, kind of a proliferation of nonsensical rules and absurd measures. The rules kept changing all of the time. It's all designed to create confusion because it's known. And again, I demonstrate this from the literature that if you have a confused population, they tend to turn to authority for guidance. Chapter 6 on deception makes the case that it wasn't just the fact that we were dealing with errors in the science here, and that pretty much the whole of the science trademark was fraudulent, but actually we're dealing with big lies in the totalitarian sense. So, the idea that the pandemic itself was just faked, that's that's getting into big lie territory. And again, that goes back to Hitler and Mein Kampf ultimately. So you can see that the darkness of what we're dealing with. And finally, chapter 7 deals with paranoia, hysteria on a mass scale, and means of dividing society against itself. And of course, unfortunately, the psychological operation was extremely successful in doing that because we have these deep schisms, cleavages, divisions within society. Friends and family have fallen out with one another all over the place over these issues. And it seems to be, again, coming back to our earlier division into different camps, that, if you have somebody that's firmly in camp 1, they're not going to be able to get on with people in camp 2 and camp 3, and further divisions between camp 2 and camp 3. So it's terrible, really, what has been done to us intentionally by design for purposes of war and social control. So I'm hoping that this book will be able to shed a light on some of this evil that has taken place. I'm hoping that it will help people to to see the bigger picture and start to make sense of what's happened. In the introduction, I do mention that reading this book is not something that you should enter into lightly. It's I mean, intellectually it's very dense, but emotionally it's very challenging because it involves to an extent going back and revisiting all of these horrible things that were done to us, and in that respect, kind of working through a trauma. I talk about the book as a process of anamnesis, remembering in chapter one, because you have to remember what was done to be able to actually break free of the orbit of the abuser, and indeed to hold them accountable for their actions. So there's a great tendency at the moment to just breathe a sigh of relief and think, oh, thank goodness that COVID era is behind us. Let's move on. But unfortunately, the COVID era was just the start of what could actually be much, much worse if it's allowed to play out as the controllers want it to.
I totally agree. Very good synopsis. This is a truly a life-changing book. I think that it is capable of moving people from Camp 2 into Camp 3. And the more people we have in Camp 3, the better we will handle the next event that is thrown to us, that is probably already been designed and it's just waiting to launch. So, a very important book, and I want to thank you. I want to thank you for writing it, and I want people to know how they support your work, because I understand that your work might be in jeopardy, but you need to continue this important work. The book that you wrote under common, please help me.
Creative Commons 4.0
Yeah,
license.
Creative Commons, that you are not making any money from people downloading this book for free. You're writing other books. Your work is in jeopardy. You need to support your family. So a few links. The Springer link for the new book, but it's also available on Academia, where you publish. You have papers, books, and interviews. So it's ulincoln.academia.edu. Of course, this will also be all in the description of the video. And finally, the way to donate to David's work is buymeacoffee.com, D.A. Hughes. I was hoping to find your Substack newsletter functional, but I found it, but you haven't started working on it.
Not yet. No, I've got a lot going on. So thanks for bringing this to attention, Len. So yeah, so the first thing to point out in terms of the book that's just been published, COVID-19 Psychological Operations and the War for Technocracy, I managed to achieve mission impossible in some ways by attracting £14,000 of funding to make this book open access. Now, all of that goes straight to the publisher, that money. But what it does mean is that the book is free, completely free, 400 pages, triple peer reviewed, passed all the quality control checks, etc. It's got all of the kind of academic imprimatur, and it's the kind of sum total of 3 years of hard intellectual and emotional labor. All of that is free to you at the click of a button. So if you follow the link on screen here, you'll find a download link. And under the Creative Commons 4.0 license, it means that not only can you download it for free, but you can legally share it and redistribute it and re-upload it for free to really spread the word, because understandably it's being shadow banned all over social media, as you would expect. Now, the flip side of those arrangements are that I don't actually earn a single penny from the publisher for this. So what I would urge readers with a conscience to do is consider supporting my work, giving something back, perhaps, if you find something of value in this book. How much would you spend on a normal book, and how much do you think this is worth? Please just give what you can if you think there's something of value here. And this is particularly important to me at the moment because for reasons I won't get into here, my career in academia is now coming to an end. So I'm being made redundant at the moment. The timing is very interesting. So I'm in a bit of a crisis situation now. I do have a young family to support, including a son with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And it's going to be a very uncertain and difficult year ahead. And I need to kind of work out where to go and what to do next with my life. So if anyone has any ideas, please let me know. But what it means also is that I'm trying to raise money as well to support the writing of volume two of this book. Everything we've spoken about today has just been volume one, but from the beginning, it was envisaged as a two-volume project because there's just so much to say. The psychological warfare was so complex. So volume two has already been started. I know exactly where I want to go with it, but I won't be able to write it if I just have to go out and get some normal job that takes up all my time. So if the public wishes to see volume two written or just wants to support me anyway because of these challenging times, I would be very, very grateful for any donations at this point. The buy me a coffee thing, the trouble is, it's a single one-off donation. It's not a great deal of money. Obviously, I'm grateful for any donations and contributions that come in, but they do take a 5% cut, and that's before the kind of payment transaction fee is taken as well. So quite a bit goes from there. If you follow the academia.edu link below on screen rather, and replace the word books with papers, I've got a document in there called Support My Work. And there are multiple other means by which you could consider supporting me, including bank transfers, crypto, postal, even things like if anybody's willing to help finance a kind of bulk purchase of the hard copies of this book, then I can get a 40% discount on those, and they could be sold on and spread. And again, you'd be happy to kind of split the profits on that to get this out there. I suspect it may not be too long before the book itself gets banned if my theories about emergent totalitarianism are correct. So I do genuinely need support at this stage, and if anyone can help me to keep producing this work, I'd be very, very grateful.
We certainly should do that. I highly recommend joining the Substack family.
Oh yes, on that, yeah, just to say,
Right. It
yeah,
just
I do have a Substack page, dhughes.substack.com. I haven't started writing on there yet, but I am about to. And I'm also trying to get my own website off the ground at the moment. It's not live yet, but it will be www.omniwar.org.
yes. I'm sure we're looking forward to more information, new revelations, better ways of thinking about what transpired and what will transpire with Homo sapiens. I think this is a not only a class war, this is a species war. We are basically trying to preserve humanity as we like it.
Yeah, and again, lest that sound like an exaggeration, go and read the Policy Horizons Canada document from 2020, and they're talking in exactly these terms, which point towards the end of Homo sapiens and the rise of some kind of synthetic cyborg-like alternative. So there are these kinds of documents that are out there at high levels in multiple countries around the world. We have to take them seriously.
And the most profound thought that I have that it's already happening and it's happening without our consensus. So, by any stretch of imagination, human rights, civil rights, Nuremberg codes, Geneva Convention, they're all been just put through a shredder, and this is now our new reality.
Yeah, and again, people need to understand the scale of what's taking place here. I mean, you're quite right. All of that has just been completely trampled over. The fundamental pillars of liberal society and of the kind of modern political system of the nation state just being ripped out from under us now. So I get into this more in the next book, Wall Street, the Nazis and the Crimes of the Deep State. But what we're looking at here is a transformation in political economy, which is essentially seeking to replace what you might call the, I don't know, a liberal order, or at least Republican order, going right back to the 18th century and the French and American revolutions, and all of these ideas about liberal democracy, balance of power, rule of law, and so on, which have been around for several centuries. They are being torn up in front of our eyes at the moment. So let's be clear about the scale of the challenge that we are here facing.
Thank you for your final words, David. This interview will not go unnoticed. I actually recommend starting your Substack by publishing all the interviews, because
Yes.
when I reached out to you, I said, you just published the book. I cannot find a single interview.
The thing about me is that I don't like the limelight, and I don't like self-promotion, and I've been quite happy to just quietly do my thing and quietly beaver away on this. But circumstances are now compelling me to actually learn a bit of marketing and promotional and business skills and all the rest of it. So that aspect I'm not so good at, web design and all of that, not so good at, could use a bit of help there maybe. But yeah, I'm kind of radically reorienting my life at the moment, and I will get all of that material out there for sure.
Excellent. You're welcome to reach out. I live on Substack. I live on Twitter. Do you have a Twitter account, or you're just...
No, I've deliberately avoided social media for many years for reasons which you can probably understand.
Of course. Okay, David, thank you so much for your time. It's been terrific.
Thank you, Len. I really, really appreciate the chance to come on.